Hello everybody, it's almost Halloween time, yeah! So, I've been thinking about doing a Halloween project, and my usual MO would be to start everything from scratch, but this time, since it's a quick Halloween project, I think I'm gonna use molds. It's okay to use molds. I know that we always want to make everything as personalized as possible. So whenever I use a custom manufactured mold or a texture or anything like that, I try to modify it to make it my own. And then that way, at least I know that nobody else is going to have this exact same design. So that's one of the cool things about molds. Is fast and easy. The drawback is other people have access to it. The best thing would be to make your own custom molds, which I'll make a YouTube video about that next time. If you guys want to, make sure you put it in the comments. And
if you found this content helpful, let us know. All you have to do is hit like and subscribe. And that'll allow us to keep making more and more content for metal clay artists just like you.
so initially I was going to make a skull, but as I did a little bit of shopping, I found some of these really cool molds. I got these online, a place that starts with an A, and it's kind of cool. This is a brain. This is kind of cool. And if I might try to make a ring out of that, a brain ring would be would be really cool. I ended up using this guy here, and this beautiful crow. He's got a bunch of detail inside of there, and I'll put the link in the description down there so that you guys can get one if you want one. And I'll probably end up putting some of these in my shop too as well, so you can look for these plus additional cool ones that I found in my shop. So let's get to it. This spellbinding pendant is made from sterling silver, a 2mm red CZ, labradorite, and sterling silver plated with gold. So this mold I got on Amazon, and it has a lot of beautiful detail in it. There's individual feathers, you can see an eye, there's the beak and the feet. And this mold is a little bit different because it has what we call undercuts. And with regular molds, it's pretty much just you push the clay in and then you can lift it right out. But with this one, the mold actually comes up and around so that you get more of a rounded shape. But because of that, you can't pull the clay out when it's wet because it'll distort. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we dry the clay first before we take it out. I'll start off by taking the clay and creating a sort of a cone shape and then pushing into the beak because the beak has the biggest undercut. And then I'll go in and I'll push the rest of it into the mold. Now, I'm pressing really hard because I want to make sure that the clay gets in every nook and cranny. And we're going to be, it is a lot of clay, so we're going to be removing some of this clay. I start off just by slicing off the top to make it nice and flat on the back. And then I'll take a palette knife. Then this is sort of a thicker, number 2 rounded palette knife. And what this is doing is this is concaving the back of the pendant. It's removing clay, so it's going to make the piece a lot lighter. And that way you don't have a big heavy necklace, and you have clay that you can reuse at another time. So I'm going to just scrape out as much as I can, also knowing that I'm going to be carving this afterwards. So you got to keep that in mind because I'm going to be taking away material. I'll take a wet finger and smooth it all out. Make sure that there's no bumps and lumps. And the water actually lubricates your fingers so it just glides right over the clay. And it makes it nice and smooth so you don't have to sand it or anything like that. This gets put on the mug warmer and that's going to dry. So next I'm going to sand this with a 100 grit sanding sponge on the edges. 100 grit is a little aggressive, but there were some unsightly lumps that were on the edge, and I just wanted to remove that rather quickly. Notice that I'm always bracing my piece so that I'm not putting a lot of tension on one end of the piece, because the piece can crack. This is still the greenware stage, so we want to make sure that we're supporting it properly. I think this might make a nice ring. Okay, so next I'm going to take some 600 grit sanding sponge, excuse me, and it's a lot finer than the 100 grit, and I can get in here and smooth out some of these details. The back had a little bit of distortion or something that was going on, so I'm just going to use the edge of my sanding sponge to get in and just really clean that up and make it nice and smooth. I'm just going to slightly bevel that edge on the outside, just slightly, because I'm going to be putting a frame around it, and I want the transition between the pendant and the actual frame to stand out a little bit more. So that's what that slight bevel was. Next, I'm just going to take this eyebrow brush and then just clean this up a little bit, get off all the sanding dust just to make sure that the sanding dust isn't inside of any cracks or anything like that, because sometimes sometimes you'll have a crack and then the sanding dust will get caked into the crack and it'll look like the whole thing is perfect, but it's actually not, because you'll have sanding dust in the crack. And then once you go clean it off, then that crack is going to be apparent. So I try to use the brush throughout my whole entire process just to make sure that there's no issues. That's looking pretty good. You'll notice that I carved the back here as well, and I'll talk a little bit about carving later. The next step is to create a small frame around the cameo. And I'll do that by creating a clay snake. And if you've not rolled out a snake, make sure that you get a nice fresh piece of clay or freshly rehydrated, because otherwise it'll have cracks. What I'm doing here is I'm rolling back and forth. The tips of my fingers are actually on the table, and there's a small gap where the snake can roll in between the Teflon on the table and the plexiglass snake roller. And you can control the thickness of the snake by pressing harder to make it thinner or a little bit looser to make it thicker. You can also taper it. This one has a little bit of a taper to it, but it's not necessary for this design. And when you get enough, just give it a test to make sure that the snake is long enough. And in this case, it looks like it is. So now we're going to connect that frame, that snake frame, around the cameo. And this is a dry to wet connection, since the cameo is dry but the snake is a wet piece of clay. So we're going to add water to the cameo. The water activates the binder, and then when you apply the snake will conform to the shape of the cameo, and the wet binder that has been activated by the water that's on the dry piece will combine with the wet piece of clay, and it'll create a nice seal. Going to use my wet brush here to shape that frame a little bit. And also going to add a little bit of water in between the frame and the cameo, because I want a little bit of separation. I don't want it to start smashing in together. Just going to work on the shaping a little bit here. Again, this is using a wet brush. This is looking pretty good here. Okay. Gonna clean this edge up here just a tiny little bit. It's looking a little bit fussy there. I'm going to take my fingers and I'm just going to press in and distort that frame just a little bit. In my mind, it's almost like a gnarled tree trunk or something like that, which has grown around the frame. So I'm just going to press it so that it looks like knots of a tree. Again, a little asymmetrical knottage, if you will. So as I go in here, I'm just going to make a little bit of refinements with my finger. This place over here is just looking a little too pointy, so I'm going to press that in a little bit more. This one needs a little indentation here. And really, this is all up to you, this section, because you can just make it look like whatever you want. So now I'm going to add a little bit of texture to the wet clay. And this is an eyebrow brush. And it has a nice straight brush line, which I can use to pounce a texture into the clay. And I'm just going to pounce, 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 starting at the top, and then you'll see I'm coming in from the side here as well. You want to make sure that you get it everywhere that you want it. Now, when I'm pouncing from the top, since I have a wet piece of clay and a dry piece of clay, of course, the dry piece of clay will not take the texture of the pouncing of that brush, but the wet clay will. And you're actually doing two things here. You're adding the texture, and you're also helping that shape and connect that clay to the cameo. And again, remember the sides as well. All right, on to the next step. Okay, so this piece has been in the dryer, and I did a little test here. You get a little preview about what's coming up. And next, what I want to do is carve the frame of the back of the piece so that it looks consistent with the back side of the brooch, or excuse me, of the pendant. Again, while I'm carving, I'm supporting the piece from underneath. This is really important because these pieces are in the bone dry stage or the greenware stage. Either terminology is fine. We borrow the greenware stage from the ceramics industry. And notice when I'm carving, I'm holding it like a pencil, and the angle is almost horizontal. I am not coming in at a severe angle to make these cuts. It's really just more of a pushing, pushing the blade horizontally to the piece. You'll get much more control this way because the tool is not going to gouge directly into the clay, and it'll just cut right along. These will get dull. These were made for wood and not made to carve metal clay, so they will get dull, but I would recommend that you buy the sharpening kit, and you can sharpen these as you know, and keep them nice and sharp, and they'll last a really long time. I've had a set of these probably for a good 10 years now. The only thing that I've ever had happen to this is one of them actually broke, and that's not because of anything that I was carving, because I was just using it improperly on another project. So take care of your tools and they'll take care of you. I'm going to go in, and for me, what I like to do in this type of carving is just an overall texture is to just go in, and I like to take off all the high points, make sure that there's nothing too pokey, and then also go in and make sure that there's not any large sections that need to be carved. Okay, let's go to the next step. Okay, so for the next step, we are going to be setting a 2mm CZ, and this is a cubic zirconia lab grown. And I have it labeled 2mm, but I always check to make sure, remeasure, because sometimes I'll put the wrong gemstone in the wrong size. So that's definitely the 2mm. And I'm going to get a setting burr. Now this is used in traditional metal smithing. And this is, this is a set actually, and it has multiple sizes. And you'll notice the shape of it, technically called a setting burr. It has a cylinder shape and then with a cone on top of it. And I'm just going to use this by hand. Since this is traditional metal smithing tools, you wouldn't want to put this inside of the flex shaft like you regularly would, because you will end up taking away too much material. So what I do is I just drill it by hand and just hold the setting burr in your hand, and then just give it a little bit of a twist. Now here I was just struggling a little bit with the accuracy about what angle I was going to put it in, but once I had that figured out, then it's just a matter of making a small hole, starting slowly and then giving it a twist. And I like to wipe off the excess a little bit just to make sure that I'm getting a nice clean hole. Now after that, I'm going to give it a little test and see if that cubic zirconia fits in there. It does not, so I need to drill a little bit deeper. Okay, I'm going to drill out this hole a little bit more here. It's a little bit better angle for me to see as well. Notice I've changed the placement. I've changed how I'm holding the pendant. I keep my brush handy because I want to make sure that I don't have any sanding dust in there, and I am just going to do another loose fit. Now this will be a process of drilling a little bit, brushing it off, fitting, doing the dry fit, and you might have to do this several times to make sure that it fits properly. And if you go little by little, then you should be able to get that correct size and drop that stone right in there, and it should fit pretty nice and tight. We're going to do another check here just to see how this fits. That's looking pretty good. However, that hole was a little too big. So I'm going to roll out a little ball of snake, push it into the eye socket, and press it in as much as I can. Because I want to fill that back up. And again, this is only because I drilled that hole too big. So I'm just going to make a little indentation here with my rubber tipped clay shaper, just so that I can push in the gemstone. What I'm doing here is I'm just removing a little bit of the excess clay because I know that I'm going to be filling that hole with the gemstone. I can take away a lot of that clay because it's going to start squeezing out once I put the gemstone in. Again, using my gem tongs, I will just pick that gemstone right up, flip it over, make sure that the point is where I want it to be, and then gently put it into that clay that is now wet. And don't drop it like I just did. All right, let's see if I can pick this little guy up. Okay, press it in with my finger. And then to get a little bit more pressure on it, I'll just take the flat edge of the tweezers and press it in. Getting it in as deep as I can, make sure that's appropriate. Meaning the girdle will be slightly below the depth of the clay, the surface of the clay. So now I'm just using a wet brush to brush away a little bit of that excess that has squeezed out. And to help shape it as well, I'll use the rubber tip clay shaper. And I'm wiping off any excess clay from the gemstone, because if you leave the clay on the gemstone, it'll end up clouding the gemstone. So you want to make sure you remove that. Okay, that's looking good here. Next, we're going to move on to the leaves. And to do that, we're going to make a 2-part silicon mold compound mold of the back of a leaf. You'll notice that the veins on the leaf are pushed into the mold, and that's what's going to make a nice texture for our leaves. Also, you may notice that this was shot a little bit out of order since the frame is not around the cameo, but that's okay. I'm just going to use this to shape some of the leaves, and you'll see how this works. So get a fresh piece of clay and roll it into a small cone shape. I'm going to line up that cone shape on the main vein of the leaf and press it in. And you'll see how that is already starting to look like a little tiny leaf. I'm going to press it to make a little bit of a stem feature. And then you'll notice how that just gently folds right over, just like a natural leaf. And you can actually fold it around something that's dry like this, or you can just let it fold over naturally. Now, because I'm going to be making several of these, I'm not intentionally not going to pay attention to how much clay I am using. And what I mean by that is I'm going to get varying amounts of clay, because if I have the same amount, all the leaves will end up looking the exact same in the exact same shape. But if I vary the amount of clay, each leaf is going to be individual, just like it is in nature. And you'll notice how, again, I'm pressing in, and I'm pushing the clay in together, and it is creating that main vein that creates a lot of stiffness and frigidity, as they call it, on the leaf. Now look at that. It just folded over so nicely. And I could just leave it like that and let it dry. But I'm going to shape it around here just because I feel like I want a little bit more control over this. Okay, so next I'm going to roll out another snake, and I'm going to put this on the back of the pendant. Initially, I had an alternate design, and you can see that on the left, and I was going to make a loop that fits on top of that, a circular ring that fits on the top of the pendant. But I changed my mind, and the design evolved into something that was more simple. So I've taken that snake and I'm going to shape it into a circle, and much like the frame that we worked on earlier, I'm just going to shape it with my fingers, pushing it into this organic sort of stick-like shape, stick-like frame shape. And, just working it with my fingers, knowing that I'm going to be carving this. So I put this on the dryer, and now that it's all dry, I am going to carve it. And just like I had mentioned before, keep that carving tool on a more horizontal plane, and again, slowly push it, holding it like a pencil. Be mindful of your fingers, because if this slips, you don't want the gouge to carve right into your finger. So push it gently with control. You'll see how my fingers are actually touching. My left hand and my right hand are touching each other. So I have a lot of control when it comes to pushing that gouge, and making sure that you have the control you need by pressing your fingers together. And you'll also notice that my hands are the forearms are resting on my workbench. So I'll continue to carve all the way around, and I'm actually I'm actually carving on only the part that is the front part of this loop, because I'm going to be attaching it to the back. So I don't really need to carve the back. However, I do want to make sure that I get all the way around on the inside and on the outside, just to make sure that it looks all like one cohesive texture. Okay, we're almost done here. I'm just going to take care of some of these little high points here and just carve them off gently. And just a reminder to keep your hands on the workbench while you're carving. So because this has a very high relief of the crow, when I go to carve this, or when I go to assemble this, I'm just going to create this little, it's like a little stand that holds the piece flat. If I were to just put this directly on the table, it would be crooked because of that high relief. So I'm just going to take that and just straddle the two sponges. And this is going to be a dry to dry connection. So remember, dry to dry connection means that you add water to activate the binder on both of the dried pieces. And instead of using slip, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a fresh piece of clay, and I'm going to roll it out into a snake. And the reason that I'm doing this is because instead of using slip, which is a little bit thinner, because of the convex back of the pendant and the shape of the component that I'm adding, I'm going to add this snake and use it instead of slip. And what this will do is this will go into all the uneven texture surfaces and fill that in, so that if I wanted to do something like fill it full of resin after it's all fired, I could do that without the resin spilling out. Now, I'm not going to do that here, but I just want to make sure that I have a nice seal. You'll notice that I've also added the leaf, and that's going to be the bail of the pendant. Again, I'm using a little bit of clay here, and I'm going to use my X-Acto knife to cut off the excess. Now, this little lump of clay will do two things. It'll raise it above above the back of the pendant, which will make it a little bit higher, and it'll also serve to act as the slip by creating a nice bond with a dry to dry connection using fresh clay. So as I add this component, I realize that I did not activate the binder on the back of the pendant. I should have added a little bit of water. But I'm feeling like that there was enough water that I added to the fresh clay snake that I don't think that that's going to be a problem when I press it together because there is so much clay in there. However, I will go in later on and add a little bit of extra clay, or excuse me, a little bit of water all around the edges. But for now, I'm just going to clean up the bale here. I want to make sure any of those lumps that, that are holding the clay together look nice and tidy. And then I'm going to now try to fix my mistake just by adding water and making sure that that whole area is saturated. I don't think it'll be a problem. I added a lot of water to that, and as I press down on the connection, it seems like it's nice and firm. These are the little things that are sort of the rule breakers, right? You have your standard way you can do things, and the more familiar you become with the clay and the more familiar you become with the different types of connections, and after a few firings you'll have an idea of how far you can push the material so that you can fudge things, as we say, and they will still work. So again, I'm just adding water, and now I'm adding a little bit of clay in here because I see that there was a little bit of a gap that I needed to just fill in. So I'm going to push that in there with a wet brush. Now I'm noticing that there's some of the clay snake was sort of coming out between the two pieces. So what I'm doing now is I'm just taking the wet brush and I am pressing that clay in so that it looks nice and neat. I could also use a rubber tipped clay shaper to do this, but the wet brush just happens to be in my hand and I'm just going to go with it like that. Now, since I am going to be putting something inside, I'm going to take my time and make sure that there's no excess clay that's showing that I don't want to show. And I'm also brushing the outside, excuse me, the back of the pendant with water completely, and that will help soften some of those cut lines. Let's just give it a little check here to see. All right, good. That's going to, looks like it's going to hang properly. And just checking my final work just to make sure everything looks okay. You should get in the habit of checking all around your piece. It kind of makes sense, but sometimes in a rush we can forget to make sure that we check all the different pieces. I'm going to show you now a couple of alternative bales really quick here, just so that you can get an idea of what you can do with the clay. Those bales are super easy to make. You can see right now I'm just going to roll this out, and it's really just a matter of finding a design that you might like and draping it over. This could be a nice vine if I added some leaves to it. It could be, I could add another component to the top, but that's definitely just one of the ways that we could approach the bale on here. Okay, let's check out another option here. Okay, so I'm going to roll out the snake again. And you'll notice I'm rolling it out on the table. I don't have any lubrication on the table. This is just a nice smooth surface. You want to make sure that whatever you're rolling on is nice and smooth and doesn't impart any texture to it. So that's, the table here seems to be really good. Now you can do a nice simple bale, and this is just going to sort of create this loop on the top and then drape it over the edges. You can see how that would turn out nicely. And what's nice about this technique is, again, you can customize it accordingly by adding components to it. It might be nice to add a couple of leaves and maybe maybe a few circles or balls that are added to the bale to give it a little bit more movement or dimension. Okay, so the next piece I'm going to create is the skull that goes on the back of the pendant. And this is more of a traditional push mold where you just push it directly in. This does not have any undercuts like the first mold that we used. So this is relatively simple. We don't even need to dry it when we pop it out. We can just leave it wet and pop it right out. It's a little bit hard to see here, but there's some edges that need to be cleaned up. And the way that I usually do that is I'll just take either a X-Acto knife or a nice what's called a pin tool, which is what you see here. It's similar to an awl, but a really fine pin-like awl. And that will cut the clay with very little drag. And if there's any pieces that need to be cleaned up, you can certainly shape it with your fingers, or here I'm just using the edge of the brush, the handle of the pin tool. I noticed that the eyes need a little bit of refinement, so I opened one of the eyes up, and there's like an eyeball, for a lack of better words, that fits inside of there. So I'm just going to go ahead and add that. There was one on the left side, but the one on the right side didn't turn out, so I'm just going to go ahead and add that in there. So now I'm just going to take this and take a wet brush and open up the eye sockets a little bit more, and just work those skull sockets. Now this is hot because this has been on the hot plate, but just use caution because it can get a little hot. That's why I use the tweezers. And because it's been on the hot plate, I am going to add a lot of water to this. This is a wet to dry connection. I want to be sure that that binder gets activated on that dried piece. And then I'm just going to push the skull component right inside of there. Now, because this clay is wet, I have the ability to manipulate it a little bit and sort of work with that jawline to push it inside the frame piece. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to make it look nice and neat, nice and tidy, as much as I can. This piece is an organic piece, so you do have a little bit of leeway, but don't use the excuse of being an organic piece for sloppy craftsmanship. We don't want that. We always want to make sure that our craftsmanship is on point and make sure that all the seams have been healed and there's no excess clay, and make sure that you go through your own quality control type of process here. I'm going over this with a wet brush now, and I want to make sure that I just get all the way around to make sure that there's some separation between the frame and the skull. Just working on this a little bit here. Okay, that's looking pretty good. That's gonna go onto the hot plate, mug warmer, candle warmer, whatever you got, food dehydrator, and that just needs to dry. Okay, fast forward, it's dried. And now I'm going to go in here and use my tweezers as a tool, like a scraper type tool, to take off a little bit of clay that I have seen that's on here. Clean up that eye socket on the bird a little bit. There was a little bit of clay. It's hard to see on here, but there was a little bit of clay on the gemstone. You want to make sure that the gemstone is nice and clean before you fire it. If not, that gemstone will turn out cloudy because that silver that's on top of the gemstone and it will fire and put a silver coating on the gemstone, which will unfortunately just look like a cloudy gemstone. I found a slight seam on the bird wing, so I'm just going in there. It's a little hairline crack, seam, whatever it is, and I just went in there. I pushed a little bit of clay in there, and now I'm just working the excess. I've wiped it off with the rubber tip clay shaper, and now I'm going back in with the pin tool and I'm adding detail into the piece that I just added. So the ultimate result will look like one piece without a crack. And that's really one of the beauties of metal clay, is that you can really go in as many times as you need to, and you can add clay and you can heal up the seams, and it will look like nothing ever happened. The same is true if you break something. You know, if you have like if I accidentally dropped this on the floor and I had I had this thing cracked in half, I could go in and I can do a dry to dry connection and attach those two pieces together just like a puzzle. And once it's together, I can heal that seam with a little bit of excess clay, do some sanding or some wet sponge work on it, and it will look like that piece has never been broken at all. And that's really one of the beauties of metal clay, is that it is very forgiving, and you do have an opportunity to heal all of those seams. Okay, so now I'm giving this one final check. I'm using the rubber tip clay shaper to make sure that there's no sanding dust or no wet clay around that eyeball. Here I'm using one of my favorite tools, which is the eyebrow brush. This particular eyebrow brush has a nice brush at the end of it. I got this at Walgreens and I use it all the time. And I think it was like $4.99 or something, and it's really one of my favorite tools. All right, just doing a little bit of quality control check here. Now it's time to fire it. Yeah! Okay, so the piece is all nice and dry, and to fire this thing, I need to fire it in vermiculite. And the reason for that is because it's a concave piece or convex piece, however you want to look at it, and the whole thing needs to be supported. In addition, I also have that bail on the back, and that bail bumps out, so I want to make sure that the whole thing is fired in vermiculite so that we don't get any distortion. If I put this right on the shelf, then that piece would have a tendency to try and flatten out, and that bail would end up flattening out, and perhaps even the pendant might flatten out. So I'm going to slow this down here so you can see how I program the kiln. And I got this kiln at Rio Grande. Clearly I've had it for a long time. E6 is running through the self-diagnostic, and it'll have a bunch of numbers that are on here. And the first thing I'm going to do is program it and find what the user program is. So I happen to be on user program number 6, which is user defined. The next button is my ramp, and that ramp is showing full ramp, which means it's going to go from 0 to the target temperature as fast as possible. And the next step is putting in the target temperature of 1598. And the next step is to hold that temperature for 1 hour. And now the kiln will ask me for a second ramp, which I do not need, so I'll leave that at 0. And then I'll hit the start button. It's pretty easy. I wait until I hear the first click and I see it start to blinking, and it says run on the right hand side, and that way I know that everything is great with the kiln and it's going to go through the proper program. Okay, it's like Christmas time. So it's done. I said Christmas time. It should be Halloween time. So the crow is done and getting ready to pull it out of the kiln. So let's go to the kiln. Okay, so this is the piece. Kind of cool. You can see it's white. A little bit blown out there, sorry about that. You can see that it's white, and this is what it looks like when it comes out of the kiln. There's the back. And the silver on there needs to be burnished down so that it looks nice and shiny like a regular piece of silver. So we're gonna go over to the flex shaft and we'll take care of that. We're also gonna add a little bit of patina, and I'll show you that process as well. Here's a little bit of a close-up. You can see the detail on the wings. You can see each individual feather. There's leaves, there's texture, there's carving, and I think this turned out pretty great. So let's move to the next step. Okay, I'm over here at the finishing station, and I have my jewel tool, so I decided I'm going to use the jewel tool instead. And this is a nice tool to really quickly polish this up. So this blue wheel is 400 grit silicon wheel, and I have the ventilation going, which you can see the tube coming out of the back, and it's really just a matter of pressing this up against those bristles. These bristles get into the nooks and crannies of it all, and it's a really good tool. You could also use a brass brush to finish this, but I just find this method to be a little bit quicker, but it's also a little bit more, a lot more expensive than just your standard brass brush. But you can see there's a little bit of a shine starting to develop, especially on the skull part there. So I'll go in and just keep working this piece until I get the finish that I want. This is not going to be a high polish finish at 400 grit. You can see here how silver it's starting to look. Now, for the other side, I'm going to put my finger over the gemstone while I polish it up. This wheel is not safe for gemstones, and especially after it's been used, you can get silver particles on there, and the metal can rub up against the gemstone and cause it to scratch, or it will start to abrade the gemstone and you'll get a haze on it. But this is looking pretty good right now, and look at that, it's nice and shiny. So because the wheel is large, there are some spots where it was not able to polish. So I'm going to go in with the flex shaft, and this is, again, the same type of wheel, but just smaller. Again, it's 400 grit, and that'll allow me to get right up to the bird and make sure that that background is nice and polished. And sometimes, there's places like the branches, in between the branches and the leaves and stuff, that this tiny little wheel will really help to get in there. You'll notice I'm using my finger to just, make sure that that gemstone doesn't get scratched up. But with this small size and the flex shaft, it's really easy to just avoid that area, and you don't really necessarily have to put your finger on it, but just use caution when you're around the eye. And then moving to the back, making sure that it gets nice and polished on the inside of that frame that I made. And then, of course, you'll want it to be polished behind the bail as well. So I'm able to go in here with this and actually just push those bristles in there, and it'll go inside of the bail, and I'll be able to shine up the inside of the bail. And this is really up to you of how far you want to go with the polishing. I just end up using the 400 grit as my final piece, but you can go all the way up and make the background, make the whole thing super, super shiny. You could throw this in the tumbler as well, and that'll do a good job. But you can see how much more it looks like jewelry now instead of a white piece of metal. Now we're gonna. This is from Autofray, and it's called Silipum, and this is a silicon wheel which is safe on gemstones. So this is what I'm going to use to polish around the eye to make sure that it doesn't get abraded at all, and this will be safe to use on here. And I just go in. This is a flat wheel, but there's also a knife point as well, which has a really nice sharp edge to it, which you can get into, again, all of those nooks and crannies to make sure that it's completely polished. Just have a few other areas that I'm going to polish up here. And there we go. Now the next step is to apply the patina. So that's what that looks like on the back. Okay. This is liver of sulfur gel, hot water, and also some water with baking soda to neutralize it. I also have a pair of tongs and a wire, which I'll suspend the piece with. Make sure you have some paper towels as well. So I don't really measure. I just put like a squirt of this liver of sulfur into the water. This is probably a little bit too much, but it's pretty forgiving. And the water, I just heat it up in the microwave. It does have to be warmed for the reaction to happen. The warmer the water, the faster the reaction will happen. So make sure you don't boil it. It shouldn't boil. It should just be, a nice sort of almost like a cup of coffee hot. So I'm just going to dunk this in. I put it on the wire, and you can see the reaction's happening fast already. I could stop here. That's looking pretty good. But I'm going to get it as black, as dense as possible. You saw how quickly that reaction happened, and you can actually build up different colors, gradating from like a light yellowish color, and sometimes you'll get blues and greens and all sorts of interesting rainbow type effects. There's a lot of fun things that you could do with liver of sulfur. This time I'm just going to do it black and have it be this sort of a gunmetal gray / black. So just going to neutralize it in the baking soda. And let's take a look at our final result here. Now this is pretty cool, and I was very tempted to leave it black just because I really liked how that looked. But, the back is nice as well. But I'm going to go ahead and remove some of the patina. And I'm going to do that by using, again, the flex shaft with the wheel, the silicone wheel. And basically this is just removing the patina off of the highlighted areas. You'll notice that in the nooks and crannies, the patina will stay in the nooks and crannies and the recessed areas. And again, this is an artistic decision that's really up to you of how much patina you want to leave on, how much you want to take off. Some people prefer a more shiny look, and some people prefer a darker look. And this is where your creativity can come in as well, because a patina shouldn't be necessarily an afterthought. You should really think through how this patina is going to look and how you're going to present the piece with the patina. There's lots of different options when it comes to the liver of sulfur. You can paint it on in specific areas. So for instance, if I wanted just the background of the skull to be completely solid black, I could do that just by using a paintbrush. Now the front, I was struggling with whether or not I should just leave it all black or not, but I decided to go ahead and start to take some of the patina off of the rim, off of the frame, just to see. And you can see how that all those little dots that we made, the little impressions that we made with the eyebrow brush, created that stipple-like effect. And you can see those dark little spots. Going to continue to go in and remove some of the patina from the background. Going to go in here and pull out some of the highlights of the feathers. And you can really see how that's starting to pop right now. Now, if you make a mistake and you just hate the patina, you can always pop it back in the kiln or hit it with a torch for a minute, get it to that warm peach color and hold it at that warm peach color for a minute, or you can pop it into the kiln for about 3 minutes, and that will remove all of the patina and then you can start over with the polishing and then the reapplying of the patina to get it to your liking. You can do this as many times as you want. Okay, so I've decided to add some color to the background. I think it needs to be a little bit darker. I'm just painting on liver of sulfur this time. This is the same solution that we used before, and the brush will allow me to select which parts I want to darken. And you can see that reaction is happening. It's already sort of a yellow golden color. And what I'll do is I'll just keep brushing the patina onto the places where I want the patina to show. And the reaction of the solution will continue to happen as I hold it. And if I want it to be darker, I can just add a little bit more liver of sulfur. Now I'm sort of adding it in this sort of haphazard way. I'm not trying to get a nice even patina. It's going to be a little bit mottled looking, which I really think adds to the organic nature of this. It's looking pretty good here. So now we just have to neutralize it. The liver of sulfur smells like rotten eggs, so if this is your first time using liver of sulfur, you will be surprised at how strong the smell is. So you need to make sure that you neutralize it so that you can get the reaction to stop and you can get the smell to stop as well. It is an organic compound made out of sulfur. All right, that looks great. So I'm going to put it on this labradorite necklace that I have. And I think that the labradorite goes really well with it. The colors of the background, the labradorite has that sparkle and flash to it. The gold beads, I think, add another layer of elegance.
If you found this content helpful, let us know. All you have to do is hit like and subscribe. And that'll allow us to keep making more and more content for metal clay artists just like you. Bye.